What?
Hello, hello. All
Hi, how
right.
are you?
I'm great. Let's kill the rock music, but that's kind of fun. Hi, Congresswoman Friedman. How you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm wonderful. This is exciting. Welcome to Radio Abundance. You have been on Radio Abundance before, but this is our first ever live episode. Uh, we got a little bit of the early scoop that this bill might be coming and chatting about doing a live, or not a live, but an emergency podcast today to be timely. And we thought, hey, as long as we're going to talk to you anyways, let's do it live and try a new format and see who shows up. I mean, we're gonna have the same conversation. So this is a lot of fun. So and extremely just extremely excited to talk to you again, but extremely excited about the new bill and extremely excited always to try a new fun live format.
Yeah, it's exciting. It's kind of edgy. I like it.
Super edgy.
Dangerous, kind of
As is this
dangerous.
as is this bill, maybe a little bit dangerously helpful.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you about it in a second, but I want to set this up just for the audience and for you a little bit. So first of all, you have been on Radio Abundance before. So for anybody that wants to know like your origin story, how you got here, how you think about this, go there. Today we're going to talk about the bipartisan Cut Red Tape for Housing Act. And what I want to say to you is, we have folks in our listener community who are maybe the foremost experts on their field in this sort of thing, and also folks who are coming to this movement for the first time and trying it out and see if they like it. So I bring that up and talk so much off the bat only to set up that in a moment I am going to ask you what is the Cut Red Tape for Housing Act, but I actually want you to tell me twice. First, I want you to tell me, for somebody who is joining this movement and curious and inclined to it, and a little bit of kind of the layman's big picture, high level. And then I want to both liberate and encourage you to get real deep in the wonky details, because I promise you this is the space where you're going to be rewarded for that level of nuance and statistical precision. So with that intro done, Congresswoman Friedman, what is the Cut Red Tape for Housing Act?
So what this bill does is it makes all infill housing categorically exempt from having to do a NEPA review, a review from the National Environmental Quality Act. So that would mean that if you're building housing that has federal money in it, because housing that doesn't have federal money generally does not go through a NEPA review unless there's certain things happening, like in terms of its location or its impact somehow on an environmental resource. But generally, your infill housing in an existing city like Los Angeles or Boston or Memphis wouldn't have to go through NEPA unless it was receiving some federal funding. And generally, those projects are affordable housing that have pass-throughs from the federal government, often to the state, which trigger this NEPA review. And that's a review that can take 12 months, it can take 15 months. Generally, they're approved. However, they take time and they cost money, usually a couple $100,000 for affordable housing projects that already exist in a financial knife edge in terms of making projects pencil. So we want to get rid of that amount of time that these projects are being stalled. We've heard from developers stories about losing financing or potentially losing financing because of the delays with NEPA reviews. And certainly $200,000 could go back into creating more units, a better building, and lots of other things, rather than doing a duplicative environmental review that's going to generally be approved anyway.
This does remind me a little bit of some of the action in California. We just had Michael Tubbs on the podcast, who's running for lieutenant governor. And as he spoke a little bit about CEQA reform, he mentioned, if you've done a report before and the squirrels were fine, they're probably going to be fine, even though you've changed the project a little bit. So that kind of principle of like, we've actually already checked and we don't necessarily need to rerun the whole process, I think is interesting. Now I have
and let's be clear that this bill only impacts infill housing, and it has to be a site that's already been developed. So we're not talking about going into a city and taking a park or a community garden and then without doing any looking at environmental impact, building a building. We're talking about taking a parking lot or an old donut shop or a strip mall and redeveloping it as housing. That should be generally an environmental positive, not an environmental negative, because of course, if you don't build the housing near jobs and schools and businesses, you end up building housing oftentimes in actual green spaces out in areas that haven't been developed before. So there should be a net positive to the environment from these projects, and there's no reason for them to have to go through NEPA, especially since they are going through other environmental reviews. We also exempted projects that would require the demolition of a historic structure. And as I said, these are previously developed lots that are in urban areas.
Nice. I do think this is such an important point for the movement as a whole to keep coming back to, right? Which is if you love your suburbs, much less if you love your rural area, the best way to protect both is to let dense areas be dense, right? The sort of densification of the suburbs and rural areas, like some of that is population growth for however much longer that lasts, but quite a lot of that is people being exiled from cities not pulling their weight. So this kind of infill housing where you've already got places that are developed and that are fairly dense, and that's a very natural place to build more housing. It seems ridiculous to stop that, and thank you for taking away some of those ridiculous barriers. In terms of defining, let's define infill for a second. I am looking at the fact sheet, and it says, so either 75% of the site's perimeter adjoins parcels developed with an urban use, or 75% of land within a quarter-mile radius of the site is developed with an urban use. That's how we're kind of defining that proximity to a relatively dense urban environment. And then, yeah, am I understanding right? And then we're also I'm seeing, no larger than 20 acres located on vacant or underutilized land that was previously developed for an urban use. That is how we are, in this case, defining infill. Yes, and you mentioned the demolition carve-outs. That there is
we wanted to make sure that we addressed any concerns that people might have going in as we introduce this bill. And, we want to obviously not miss something that might lead to objections. We want to make sure it's a net positive for communities. And so we use a lot of the definitions that are in the new California law for CEQA exemptions for infill housing as a viewpoint, as a guide, because they, of course, went through a year-long process of being in discussion with environmental groups and with cities. So, never one to miss taking material from people that have done their homework. And, and it seemed like a perfect time to introduce NEPA reform. I've worked on these issues for my time in the California legislature, where I served for 8 years, and have done my own CEQA, which is the California equivalent of NEPA, done bills to reform CEQA, particularly with an eye towards housing. And so I've worked in this space. And when I ran for Congress, a lot of what I talked about was bringing a lot of that same work to the federal space and look for the opportunities to do streamlining and make our processes make sense and not be barriers to the things that we know that we need to do and need to do quickly. And that's what this bill is about.
Now, it seems like, it's shining through this conversation, right? You've both written a bill that is designed to have an extremely positive impact, but you've also written a bill and thought a lot about a bill that can pass. And that's ringing through how you've learned from California and learned from what I might call handling objections ahead of time. I am curious how you see about the politics and future and timeline of this, right? I'm curious about, this is a bipartisan bill, so I'm curious about Representative Edwards and his interest in your relationship. I'm curious what kind of especially for folks who maybe aren't deep Congress watchers, right? What are the chances of passage? What is the process? How long might that take? Just curious how you would kind of game out the road from here.
Well, I only got elected in November and got sworn in January. So I'm still learning a lot about this process, but I'm very encouraged by having bipartisan support. And I'm part of a new caucus called the Build America Caucus. And so is Representative Edwards. And so he seemed like he was a natural person for me to approach. And he had questions about the legislation. And I'm really very honored that he chose to join us and co-lead this. It's great to be able to have support from across the aisle already, because if you don't have that in this particular Congress, it's very hard to get legislation passed. So that gives me a lot of hope that we can get this through. Now, I know that in Congress, they are looking at doing permit reform across the board, but I also wanted to make sure that we did something that was specific to housing and that did address legitimate concerns that people have around the environment. And I'm not sure what shape that permit reform bill is going to take. And I think it's important from the environmental perspective to introduce legislation that, yes, wants to move housing forward quickly, but also respects legitimate environmental concerns, which is why we did a bill that had guardrails around it and includes exemptions to the bill. It includes NEPA review for things like historic resources, tribal resources, and greenfields. I don't know if we're going to get that in the permit reform bill, but I'm hoping that if they see this bill, that maybe they will adopt this bill into whatever they're doing, or this bill can stand alone as its own piece of legislation. And as long as it gets passed into law and we remove these barriers and get rid of this red tape that is so needless and really slowing down and costing more money to affordable housing developers, I'd be happy with any way that we get that done.
You know, I want to ask you about the environment in a second, because you know, that looms heavily here. I want to, know how you would kind of frame for everybody what NEPA is, and the sort of background of the National Environmental Policy Act. And of course, and this came through in the last podcast we did together, a huge amount of your motivation here. And I think this movement's motivation is to do right by the environment, and to, and to stand up and raise our hands when there is environmental law that is hurting the environment. So we will talk about that in a second, but I want to quickly ask you about caucuses. It was very interesting to me when you mentioned that being a part of the Build America caucus with Representative Edwards helped you identify him as a potential bipartisan partner. And
Yes.
frankly, the importance of being bipartisan now, and that for passage, and sort of getting, if Republicans are going to be in the majority, you kind of need one of them on the, I think that's very interesting. And so I bring that up because we have talked to both Congressman Harder, who founded the Build America Caucus, Congressman Robert Garcia, founding the YIMBY Caucus. It is so cool that these caucuses exist. And it's also like, okay, now what? What does that mean? What does a caucus do? And here it sounds like you've already named one very specific function, which is just to identify and connect you with allies to get stuff done. So I am just curious for a second what those caucuses existing has meant for the work, and as somebody who's joined one, what does it mean for you? What does it do to you to be a part of that?
Yeah, so for me, it's a couple of things. It's certainly a signal of my priorities and my values to be a member of both of those caucuses. But more importantly, it does show me right away who my allies are when it comes to this work. And so we were able to very quickly secure a co-lead who is, a Republican co-lead, because we went to members of the caucus. And hopefully that also gives him the trust that I have similar goals. And then I'm hopeful that the caucus will get behind the legislation, come on as co-sponsors, and that we'll have a whole group of legislators pushing together. And it's a new caucus, and I'm new to Congress, but it's my hope too that the caucus itself has a package of bills, this being one of them, that we put forward as sort of caucus bills. And we haven't had that conversation yet because we're so new and people are still introducing their legislation for the year. But I would love to see the Build America Caucus and the YIMBY Caucus start to have a package of bills that that are known to be, kind of caucus supported bills. I was a member of a couple of caucuses in the California legislature, and we did that every year where we had our core bills, and then we had bills that we supported. And it was very helpful for people to know what the values were of that particular set of legislation. It helped for people on the outside who were stakeholders, for instance, people in the abundance movement, to know what the key pieces of legislation are and what to focus their attention on. And because, it takes a village, it takes people on all sides pushing for legislation to get through. And when you have those people coming to legislators all around the country and saying, I heard about this bill, this would help get affordable housing built in your district. I'm a stakeholder in your district. I'm a resident. I want to see this pass. It just gives them one more reason to vote yes.
Nice. It is. I find it very cool when you reflect on the idea of, you're new in Congress, and telling that story of like, you do actually, you're there, what bills are good, but now you actually do have to figure out how this works, both like interpersonally and logistically, and how to get stuff done. I guess maybe I don't watch the right TV shows, but that to me is cool to sort of openly acknowledge that. And I am curious, as somebody, who a lot of policy chops, and now you got to figure out how you're going to get results in this new space. Like, who's helping you? Who do you go? How do you find out how to get stuff done and be effective? Who feels like your kind of ally and mentor in Congress?
Well, certainly my amazing team. And, when I was interviewing people to be on staff, having these goals and an understanding of housing policy and a desire to see more housing built, and not just housing, but more clean energy, more energy transmission, all the things that we need to to live a better life and to make things more affordable for people was key in my mind. So I purposefully brought people on that were YIMBYs, to be honest about it, both in my district office and in my capital office. And so that's a big part. So that's the start, because I have people I can sit around with and talk about ideas, and who are looking actively for ideas to help with this movement, as you put it, and this goal. And also, I have certainly folks in my district that I know from my work doing very similar legislation at the state level in California. And I have a housing advisory group, and several of those people are folks that advise me on a lot of the legislation I did around parking reform and ADUs and everything else that I've worked on and want to keep working on. And then in the legislature, of course, we have, the representatives you mentioned, Robert Garcia, Josh Harder. There's a whole bunch of people who also really lean into this issue. And it's growing as the housing affordability crisis is growing around the country. We see more and more members of Congress wanting to find solutions. And housing is becoming unaffordable in places that even recently it was affordable. Young families today don't feel that they would ever be able to buy a home. And that's a fundamental change from the way things were 20, 30 years ago, maybe even 15 years ago. And so this isn't just California policy. It's not just Los Angeles policy. It's really national policy.
Yeah, looking at this bill, so I have fact sheets and everything I've been able to consume today in the last couple hours. I do not have the text of the bill. And I am very curious a little bit more about the scope of both the bill and about NEPA, in the sense of a lot of the chatter today. A phrase that keeps coming up is affordable housing. That phrase is not, though, in the fact sheet. So I am just curious if you can kind of flesh out for me, both in terms of NEPA generally, but also in terms of this reform, like what does it? We've talked a little bit about what it applies to and doesn't in terms of like infill and urban areas and previous uses and things like that. But in the spectrum of like affordable housing and who's building the housing, like what is in scope and not in scope?
So unlike CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA affects, even though single family housing is categorically exempt, and housing kind of is and kind of not through a whole patchwork of exemptions, it's a much broader review process, whereas NEPA is limited to projects that have federal funding. So you're generally not going to be talking about your market rate housing unless they're in the context of a larger project that has some federal funding. So, you can imagine I'm just going to throw it out, like a baseball stadium or some project that has some federal nexus or federal funding, or more likely a train station, a piece of transit infrastructure that might have housing attached. That might trigger a NEPA review because of the federal funding. But just a regular market rate apartment building does not go through NEPA. The projects that go through NEPA are ones that have some federal funding, any federal funding. And that's generally affordable housing, meaning housing that's built with federal subsidies and then rented through covenants to low-income individuals for reduced rent, for rent that would be cheaper than they could get from market rate housing. So that's why we refer to affordable housing, because this is generally going to help with the creation of subsidized affordable units.
What do you handicap for me the creation of subsidized affordable units, right? So not even in terms of like certainly what this bill makes possible for, but like the appetite of the federal government right now to build subsidized affordable units. And like, if we win in what is a very long time from now, like that, what can you gauge for me numerically, past, present, and what you expect the next few years in terms of like the actual appetite to build subsidized, federally funded affordable units?
Well, it's hard for me to say because I don't communicate directly with this administration.
They
seem to be, the Trump administration. It seems to me that they are not very keen on funding housing in general, and they've made overtures at closing out Section 8. Certainly the things that keep tenants in place, a lot of the programs that come through our CDBG financing that are meant to assist tenants who are on the verge of homelessness. They've made a lot of overtures towards cutting these programs. And I can tell you from speaking to our local housing authorities, they're really, really afraid of the impact on homelessness from Xing out a lot of these assistance programs. In terms of, we're still working on the budget for this year, so it's hard to say what's actually coming down the pike. And I also have not been able to really take the temperature of the majority party's interest in funding subsidized affordable housing. And look, you're not going to subsidize housing your way out of our housing crisis. And not everybody qualifies for subsidized housing. You have to be low income under certain definitions to get into one of these units. But on the other hand, there's definitely a subset of the population that needs extra help, and that's not going to be able to afford a lot of market rate housing. Folks coming out of the prison system, people who are in recovery, people who are severely disabled, a lot of our seniors end up on a very, very fixed and low, incomes, and can't afford market rate housing in our more expensive urban areas where they grew up, where they have their connections and their ties. So there's a lot of people to where subsidized housing is really a lifesaver. Recent immigrants, you could point to a lot of populations that need that kind of housing. And, we used to have a better system to create it in California through our redevelopment agencies that paid a lot of dividends back in terms of also redeveloping blighted areas and polluted areas. But we lost that when the state got rid of that particular tax increment method of financing housing. And so now developers are cobbling housing costs together through a series of tax credits and other federal programs. And so we really do need an expansion of those programs, even while we encourage market rate housing, which we also need, because there's a lot of middle class people who also need housing and who are being priced out of the market. So, there's going to be different strategies that we need to employ to get the housing that we need, and subsidized housing is definitely one of them.
JD Vance and I text each other on Signal all the time, and he's told me very clearly that he thinks once we deport all the illegal immigrants and then all the legal ones and then all the citizens that made fun of him, prices will go down. So I think we'll be fine. But even if it does occur to me, even if the Trump administration builds nothing in the next few years, that there's two giant ramifications to this bill in passing it now, even if they don't take advantage of it, which is to say a future Democratic presidency, in picking up quite a lot of pieces, will be able to build. And as somebody who says yes in my backyard to both market rate housing built by the private sector and housing built by the public sector, that excites me that you are making that easier for a future Democratic president, and we'll back that. But also, I think the message this sends to states, whether it's California, New York, or Illinois, all these states that are reforming right now, that this is another piece and another another little dent in the universe and kind of crack in the dam of showing like the momentum is on our side, and this is the right thing to do and the right thing to do from a policy perspective. And so again, even if Trump is not helpful here, it does seem like the signal this sends and the future it sets up is also valuable in addition to the immediate impacts and potential it unleashes.
Yeah, I mean, you've got a law here that's a good law with NEPA, but when it's spilling over and creating barriers for exactly the kind of housing that everybody says we need, which is affordable housing for low-income people, seniors, disabled, and others, for no reason, for absolutely no environmental gain that anybody can point to, it should be reforming that law. And this bill will lower the cost of developing affordable housing, and it will speed up the process at a time when we know we desperately need this housing to keep people from slipping into hopelessness. This will make it more affordable and to put the money back into, look, that money should be going into these buildings. It shouldn't be going into hiring consultants to write environmental reviews that have already been done through other processes. It's completely red tape. It's the kind of red tape and bureaucracy that everybody hates. So I think this bill's a no-brainer. It should be easy, and I'm hoping it will be.
Very nice. I did promise we would tee you up on the environment, so let's get into this now.
Yeah.
Right? We are talking about reform of environmental law, and
yep,
we have pretty strong feelings about how this will help the environment. I'll let you run with this, but I'm thinking give us a sense of the stakes of this sort of thing and the impact you think this will make in terms of why, both in terms of outcomes and values and morals, this is the right thing to do for the world we live in.
Sure. This makes it easier to build on previously developed infill sites in our cities on land that was already developed and that needs a new use. And we've got a lot of those around our communities. Often they're blighted, closed, rivers of concrete, closed strip malls, obsolete office buildings, and they're eyesores, and they can be, magnets for crime and blight. This would speed up the process of turning them into something that we need, which is places for people to live. It's a benefit to our cities. There's no downside. It's certainly not harmful to the environment. But if we don't do it, we know what happens. Not only do more people struggle with affordability for housing, but also people face homelessness. And when we do build, if we don't allow building in our cities and in infill sites, people will build in places that haven't been developed before. And that's when you have real environmental impacts. That's when you're building on land that's habitat, on land that's covered in trees, out in the suburbs where you have to now drive much further from your job, causing polluting air, car congestion, all those things that suburban development outside of cities creates. I'm an environmentalist and I'm a huge supporter of environmental laws, and I am not a supporter of suburban sprawl. It's unenvironmental. It's a terrible use of land. It causes traffic congestion and smog, and it eats up precious open space and habitat for animals who are already struggling. So this makes a lot of environmental sense, and it's my hope that environmental groups will support it on
We're
that
coming up.
basis.
Nice. Yeah, that sounds like bad stuff caused by not building housing. We should build housing.
You look, at the same time that I've authored numerous bills to speed up housing production at every level, from new market rate down to affordable housing, I have authored key bills around wildlife connectivity, around habitat protection, around biodiversity, around reducing greenhouse gas emissions and clean energy. To me, it all fits together. I don't see these goals at all at being at odds. I think that if you care about the environment, you should care about building the housing we need in the right places. And you should also care about better ways of moving people around that are more sustainable than individual car trips. I think that it's a triad that we should all be thinking about, that if you're thinking about the environment, you should also think about where you're going to grow your cities and how to do it in a sustainable way and how to move people around. So I think we need to be thinking about these issues much more in a holistic way. And I've done policies to try to link that. And just to go into the Wayback Machine from a few years ago, when I worked on parking reform, to me, it was about the environment. It was about better ways about supporting public transportation, using land better, and building the housing we need, all in one piece of legislation. So I look at this very much the same way. It's about taking away an environmental review that is actually stopping something from happening that's a net benefit, a net huge benefit for the environment. NEPA is a great and groundbreaking piece of legislation that we should protect, but we should also, as environmentalists, be very clear about fixing the things that aren't working about it so that it can't be weaponized against the environment and repealed. So just if you're thinking strategically, the last thing you want to do is have nonsensical use of NEPA that its opponents can use to justify getting rid of it. My attitude is it's a great and important piece of legislation. Let's fix the things that we know need to be fixed so that we can protect the parts of NEPA that we absolutely need to protect our environment.
Don't think for 1 second I was going to let you get out of here without plugging your work on parking and cars. And folks, if you're watching this, I think you're going to like, and you're hearing about Congresswoman Friedman for the first time, I think you're going to like what she's done before on parking and cars. You can hear a little bit about that in our first episode with her, which we'll make sure to post. But it's I was once talking with a member of Congressman Scott Peters' team, and they called him an OG YIMBY. So that has entered my vocabulary, and I would say that Congresswoman Friedman is an OG and an innovator and a pioneer of the parking wars. I got to get you out of here. So look, give us a couple seconds of final thoughts, and also, like, where do you go from here? And I mean literally, like, this is announcement day. Like, literally, where do you go from here?
Well, I would say that number one, my message for the movement is to create a big tent. I've had a lot of success at bringing environmentalists on board on this agenda. I come out of the historic preservation world, so I'm always careful to respect the goals of people who love old buildings and want to retain the character that really important old buildings give. And, I've worked on preserving buildings like the Cinerama Dome and the Capitol Records building and the case study houses in Los Angeles. And I don't see that at all at being at odds with creating the landmarks of the future. So rather than kind of throw rocks at each other, let's bring these movements together. the I Love Buildings movement, even, old and new buildings, along with the environmental movement, who understands, that we need to have these coalitions, and and find ways of building consensus and moving forward. We've been able to do it in California with a lot of success, and by the way, working also with our friends in the labor movement, who also are incredibly important, to bring them on board, so that this is a benefit for all of these major stakeholders. And that would be, I guess, my closing message. And I really appreciate your having me here today. It's exciting. When I got the invitation, I was really excited. And for those of you I don't know, it's nice to actually meet you. And we are going to be announcing more housing bills. We're working on a package of really cool housing bills, including one that's even bigger than this. So stay tuned. A lot more to come. And
Hey,
that's a teaser. You're not getting another word out of me on that.
I gotta build hype too. So so long as you let us cover that with you, we'll do the tease and the whole hype buzz process, and we can let things trickle out when the time comes. Now we are, I mean, like, honored and flattered and kind of blown away that you would carve out 30 minutes of a pretty important day to spend with us, and dive into this, and give us your perspective again, both as a sort of an innovator and a pioneer, like making abundance happen, and also as somebody who's like really accomplished on this stuff and is fairly new in Congress, and now making it happen, and learning the ropes and getting stuff done. So this has been super cool. Thanks for joining us on Radio Abundance. Onwards and upwards, and on with your day.
Thanks so much.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.